Good morning, folks. How are you today?
Good morning.
Hope you had a nice weekend, everybody. We'll just give a few seconds for others to join us. Okay, welcome back and good morning to you folks. Hope you're doing well. So we're going to get started in chapter 6 today, okay? And of course, we're back to our normal lab schedule this week, and we'll be getting ready for lab exam 2 for next week, right? Lots of things going on here. Okay, before we get started with new content, do you have any questions about the schedule or anything that's on your mind?
Good morning. I do have one question.
Okay.
Is lab exam 2 going to be set up the same way as lab exam 1?
I think probably the most accurate answer is yes. You will have pictures from visible body to identify the skeletal muscles, and you'll also have some pictures from the histology packet that we have to go over this week to be sure you have all the correct answers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right, folks, let's see what we can do then. Okay, so we're starting chapter 6 today, a brand new chapter. Let me share my screen with you here. And we'll get set up to start some notes. Okay, all right, so for lab exam 1, you spend a lot of time learning the various bones of the skeleton, but we haven't so far in the course really talked too much about, well, what bones actually are, what their tissue is, what do we find inside the bone, what are bones made of. So chapter 6 is all about tissue, the tissue, histological aspects of bones themselves. Okay. So I'm going to start with a basic overview of just some general comments about bones. All right, well, the first thing we appreciate is that, bones basically have two functions that, might come to mind immediately. And the first is support. And by that, I mean, we have our skeleton. Our skeleton allows our soft tissue, our musculature to hang around our bones, around our skeleton, and provide the typical form, structure, anatomy, and overall shape to our body. If you think for a moment, what we would look like if we had all the normal parts of our body except our bones, you might imagine that all of our soft tissue would not have any support anymore, and we would kind of collapse on the floor and kind of look like Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars, if you remember Jabba the Hutt. Okay, so one function of the bones is to provide support. Another function of bones, of course, is to also provide some limited protection for more internal organs, soft organs. Think about the bones of your skull protecting your brain, the bones of the vertebral column protecting the spinal cord, bones of the rib cage, right? Protecting our lungs, our heart, that type of thing. So bones also have a protection capacity. All right. Another function of bones is to manufacture our blood cells. You may already know this, that bones typically have two different types of marrow. There's red marrow and yellow marrow. We're going to be talking about both of them together in this chapter. Okay. So bones manufacture blood cells. Okay. Inside bones, you're going to find red bone marrow. Red bone marrow contains specialized stem cells, which are called adult-derived stem cells that have the ability to perform mitosis and manufacture new cells that differentiate into the red blood cells that we're used to and the white blood cells that form a sort of cellular defense against pathogens like strep throat bacteria, coronavirus particles, things like this. Okay, red bone marrow contains adult-derived stem cells that have the ability to reproduce and manufacture red blood cells. Okay. Here's a question for you in the chat window. What is the proper scientific term for a red blood cell? What is a red blood cell called? Okay, yes, red blood cells are red blood cells, but there's another more formal name for them. Do you know what that is? Let me give you a little hint. It starts with the letter E as in egg. Letter E as in egg. Do you know what that term is? Okay, I'm going to go with the first response I'm seeing in my chat window here. Shay, you're absolutely right. It is a erythrocyte. It is a erythrocyte. Well done, Rachel. Thank you for your response as well. Okay. So erythrocytes are the proper scientific name for a red blood cell. You know, general everyday life, we're just going to call it a red blood cell, but to a scientist, it is a erythrocyte. Okay, so the red bone marrow has the ability to manufacture red blood cells, properly called erythrocytes, and white blood cells, properly called leukocytes. All right. Well, let's see what else do our bones do for us. Our bones also have the ability to store materials, okay? And there's two primary materials I want to draw your attention to. Bones are used to store minerals, particularly calcium and phosphorus minerals. Okay, if we think about the significance of calcium, right? Calcium is important in the body in a whole number of important ways, right? Calcium is absolutely important and critical for enabling proper muscle contraction. That's something that's going to come out. We're about 2 chapters away from discussing that in a formal way here in our semester. Okay, but calcium is absolutely needed for muscle contraction. Without calcium, muscles don't contract properly. Calcium is also needed to release neurotransmitter in the brain. Okay, so without calcium, you know, we don't get things like dopamine being released or serotonin or gabapentin, things like this. We don't get these things released. Calcium is also needed for releasing some of our hormones in the endocrine system from glandular tissue. Okay, so long story short, calcium is a very important substance to the body. And so when the body has an opportunity to do so, it will store excess calcium in the bones and use it when we come into a phase of our life where we don't have access to enough calcium to function properly. All right, so phosphorus is also important for a variety of things, but the big one that I'll mention right now is phosphorus provides the phosphate atoms necessary to manufacture and assemble ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which you learned about in chapter 2, which is the biochemical energy molecule of the cell. Okay, so you can see that bones are not this kind of dumb, hollow, white colored tubes, right? I mean, they are dynamic living organs. Maybe that's something we should say. Sometimes students don't appreciate this, that an individual bone, whether it be a carpal bone of your wrist or the femur bone of your thigh, whatever bone you're talking about, an individual bone meets the technical requirements to be called an organ, right? An organ is a three-dimensional object that's made of multiple tissues interacting with each other to serve a common function. Bones are organs. Okay. Okay, just taking a quick look here at my notes. Okay, when we talk about bones being made of organs, if we were to go in and kind of dissect, let's say we dissected the femur and looked inside, what kind of things would we find? Well, believe it or not, we would find bone tissue, which is called osseous tissue. We would find some cartilage. There's some cartilage in the anatomical makeup of the bone. We would find dense connective tissue. We would actually find some epithelium in places of the bone. We'd find some adipose tissue. We'd even find some nervous tissue. I mean, if you've ever had a bone injury, whether it be a fracture or a contusion, which is sort of a crushing injury on the bone, you know that can be quite painful. Well, how do you know it's painful? It's because you can feel it. How do you feel it? There are nerve endings inside the fabric of your bone, right? So the composition of bones is made of a combination of osseous tissue, cartilage, dense connective tissue, epithelium, and nervous tissue. All right. Please feel free to ask questions along the way, folks. Okay, two other phrases I want to get into your notes at this time. You might, at various times in our course or in your career, you know, you might hear the phrase the skeletal system. Well, let's define that in a proper way. The phrase skeletal system refers to the entire network of bones that makes up our skeleton, but in addition to the bones, things that are present that hold the bones together. So they're going to be pieces of cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. The term skeletal system refers to the entire framework of bones, cartilages, tendons, and ligaments. Okay, one more term here, and that term is osteology. Osteology is the study of bone structure and the treatment of bone disorders. Osteology is a field of study which emphasizes knowledge of bone structure and the treatment of bone disorders. Okay, folks. So that begins our conversation in chapter 6, maybe saying some things that you already knew. Okay. Do you have any questions right now? Okay, so what I'm going to be doing at this time is going over parts of a long bone. So if you have your textbook accessible, let me encourage you to please open up to figure 6.1, figure 6.1, which is parts of a long bone. Let's go over this a little bit and highlight some of the anatomy of a typical long bone. In this case, they're showing us an image of the humerus, which all of you at this point are experts on in terms of being able to identify that. Okay, gang. So a couple things to keep in mind. Okay, when we're talking about a long bone here, right? Like the femur or the humerus. When we describe a bone as being a long bone, we're simply telling you that we have a bone where the length of the bone is longer than the width. That's all we're telling you. Okay. All right. Okay, so long bones have a greater greater length than width. All right, we're going to start defining some of these structures we see in figure 6.1. All right, so let's talk about the main body or shaft of the bone. That would be the middle section of the bone along the left-hand side of figure 6.1. You can see the term diaphysis. Diaphysis. The diaphysis is the shaft, or some people will describe it as the body of the bone, the shaft or body of the long bone. Okay, so if you know where the diaphysis is, then other things start to make sense. So you can perhaps consider making diaphysis sort of your anchor point for our conversation here. Next, I'll turn your attention to the epiphyses, right? If you think about a typical long bone, such as figure 6.1, you're going to have two ends of the bone, right? I mean, logically, if you think about it, there's a proximal end and there's a distal end. So there's two ends to the long bone, and both of those ends collectively are called the epiphyses. This refers to the proximal and distal ends of the bone. In addition to the epiphyses, notice the metaphyses. The metaphyses are the regions in between the diaphysis and each of the two ends, each of the epiphyses, okay, the proximal and distal epiphyses. So the metaphysis is in between a diaphysis and an epiphysis. Okay. Metaphyses, okay. The regions between each epiphysis and the diaphysis. All right. Now, there's something important that we need to talk about here, and I think many of you probably have some familiarity with this, okay? On figure 6.1, I'm going to ask you on panel A there, so the leftmost image of figure 6.1, okay? I'm going to ask you a couple questions here. Do you see the phrase epiphyseal line on the right side of picture A of figure 6.1? Do you see epiphyseal line? Okay, thanks folks for giving me some feedback on that. All right, and so what I want to ask is the following question. Hold on a second while I get my question typed out. Okay, from this image, does it appear that the epiphyseal line is predominantly Does it appear that the epiphyseal line is predominantly located in the epiphysis, or is it really in the metaphysis? Take a close look at it. Where do you see most of the line actually positioned? Okay, good. You're absolutely right. And that's the point I'm trying to make to you folks. It is a misnomer. It is a misnomer. It's kind of an oddity of some historical reason that it was named this way. No, it really should be called the metaphyseal line, not the epiphyseal line. But nonetheless, it is called the epiphyseal line. Okay, there are numerous scenarios that you will find throughout anatomy where, for historical reasons, which have sometime long gone and past, we don't even understand anymore, someone kind of misidentified something and that knowledge got entrenched into textbooks, and so it's taught this way forevermore. Okay, there are examples of this that can be brought out. Here's one of them. The epiphyseal line would be more appropriately renamed the metaphyseal line, but for historical reasons and traditions, we continue to call it the epiphyseal line. Okay, so let me take note of this. Note how most of the epiphyseal line is really found mainly in the metaphyseal region of a long bone. Okay, so it's one of those oddities. You need to look at it and be aware of it. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about this epiphyseal line. Okay, I'm going to put the notes here underneath the metaphysis because that's where this is located. You know that our bones, particularly our long bones, they have the ability to lengthen and get longer as we grow up. That way we don't stay 2 feet tall when we're 3 years old and we grow up 5, 6 feet tall, right? Okay, so I'll try to be very precise in what I'm saying here. Okay, bones that are not finished growing will have an epiphyseal growth plate. Okay, bones that are not finished growing will have an epiphyseal growth plate. This growth plate is made of cartilage. Okay, now in figure 6.1, figure 6.1 is not showing you an epiphyseal growth plate, it's showing you an epiphyseal line, and there's an important distinction here. Okay, bones that are finished growing Okay, the epiphyseal line, folks, is actually made of osseous tissue. It's not made of cartilage, okay? So it would be important to appreciate that when we are young folks, when we're adolescents, when we're still growing up, right? Our bones are going to have cartilage in that are more properly called the epiphyseal growth plates that respond to growth hormone manufactured and released by the pituitary gland of the brain, which, as you all experts now know, the pituitary gland is nestled in the sella turcica, right? The sella turcica. So long story short, as we grow up, we have an epiphyseal growth plate. And as we mature and finish growing, which is going to be at different ages for different people, right? That cartilage will differentiate. It will transform into actual bone tissue, properly called osseous tissue. Okay. During childhood, the growth plate is made of cartilage. And this plate responds to growth hormone released from pituitary gland in the brain. As we reach the end of adolescence, the cartilage in the growth plate, will differentiate into osseous tissue. The growth plate is now called the epiphyseal line. Okay. All right. So I have a question for you in the chat window. Give me just a moment to get this typed out. Here we go. If you are a forensic scientist and you locate the skeleton of a murdered victim, if you can find cartilage in the femur and humerus of the victim, was your victim a child or an adult? Okay, so I use the term child very loosely, right? I mean, that person could be 14 years old. So certainly a 14-year-old is not a child, but nonetheless, a 14-year-old is not a completely mature adult from an anatomical perspective, right? So those, those are the kinds of things that forensic scientists will look at when they recover remains of somebody that's deceased to determine, are we looking at the skeleton of an adult or someone younger than an adult? Okay. All right, thoughts or questions, gang? You might remember an old show. I don't know how many years past it's been now, but there used to be an old show on the Fox network called Bones. And I think it followed the exciting crime details of a forensic scientist by the name of Brenneman or something like that. So anyway, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, let's continue here. Talking about the anatomy of the long bone, figure 6.1. So we've just described the metaphysis, and we went on a little detour talking about the epiphyseal growth plates or the epiphyseal lines. Next, number 4 is articular cartilage. Notice that in figure 6.1, we have articular cartilage at both the proximal and distal ends of the long bone. Okay. Articular cartilage is actually made of hyaline cartilage. So articular cartilage is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage that covers the part of the epiphysis where the bone forms a joint. Now, in terms of anatomy, a more proper name for a joint is an articulation, okay? So this is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage that covers part of the epiphysis where the bone forms an articulation, okay, meaning a joint with another bone. Okay. Now, there's something that I need to caution you with here, okay? So if you have the ability to bookmark figure 6.1, go ahead and do so. What I want to do is have you go back to chapter 4 for just a moment and take a look at something for me. And I'm going to give you a page number in just a second. Okay. So if you have the ability in your textbook, please go back to table 4.6. Look at table 4.6. Okay. Type this into the chat window. Locate table. Oh, well, I'm not doing good today with my typing. Locate table 4.6. Okay. And there you're going to see hyaline cartilage. Okay. So what I want to draw your attention to is the following. Here it comes. Do you see the term perichondrium in the picture of table 4.6? Do you see the term perichondrium? Okay. All right, folks. So perichondrium is a membrane. It's a membrane that wraps around the cartilage. Okay. And what I want to point out to you is that hyaline cartilage, such as you see in table 4.6, contains perichondrium. It contains this membrane that goes around the cartilage. Articular cartilage, which is the topic of our conversation in chapter 6, articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage, but articular cartilage does not contain a perichondrium. So it's a little bit of an oddball. It's kind of like the fine print at the end of an advertisement. Yes, articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. And yes, 99% of hyaline cartilage contains this membrane called a perichondrium. But articular cartilage is an exception. Articular cartilage does not contain a perichondrium. Okay. I'll put this in your notes. While most hyaline cartilage contains a membrane called perichondrium, articular cartilage does not contain a perichondrium. All right. So, articular cartilage, just like any cartilage, really is not vascularized, so it does not have a blood supply directly in the cartilage itself. And so, if you were to damage the articular cartilage, with a sports injury or something like that, it's gonna take a long time to heal because of the lack of the blood supply. So it doesn't have fresh oxygen or nutrients to repair that location. All right, let's continue here. Back to figure 6.1, figure 6.1. I'm going to turn your attention now in figure 6.1 to another membrane that actually wraps around the surface of the compact bone that makes up bone tissue. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later on. But the membrane I'm talking about is called the periosteum. The periosteum. Okay, see if you can locate periosteum. It's sort of on the bottom half of picture A of figure 6.1. Okay, the periosteum is a layer of tough connective tissue that does the following. Okay, first letter A, it wraps around the surface of the compact bone. Okay, we haven't talked about compact bone yet, but you might recall it from your homework or reading about compact bone versus spongy bone. So the periosteum is a membrane that basically wraps around the surface of your bones. Okay, and it is made of tough connective tissue. Okay. Okay, so the periosteum wraps around the surface of the bone, and it acts as an attachment point for tendons and ligaments. Okay. Eventually, we're going to get into a conversation in this course where we kind of go to ridiculous detail, at least ridiculous for many folks, about exactly how contraction of muscle tissue leads to motion of a bone. And we got to build up our anatomy knowledge of these structures so that that conversation is going to make sense. All right, so the periosteum wraps around the surface of the bone and acts as an attachment surface for tendons and ligaments. In addition to that, the periosteum provides sort of an anchoring surface for blood vessels and nerve endings that penetrate into the interior of the bone. All right, and so perhaps we can give you a better visualization on this. If you would, again, if you can bookmark figure 6.1, go ahead and do that. But I'm going to ask you to go forward in chapter 6 a couple pages and take a look at figure 6.3. Take a look at figure 6.3. As you do that, I want you to try to find the term periosteum on figure 6.3. Picture A is an apple, the sort of the middle big large image there along the right side. You find the term periosteum. Periosteum on the right side there. And as you look carefully at that photograph, that artist drawing, if you will, what you're going to see here is notice that there are these blue and red colored blood vessels, right? These arteries and veins that are penetrating deep into the interior anatomy of the tissue of the bone. And you notice to do that, they actually have to go through the periosteum membrane. So the periosteum membrane provides a way to kind of tack down or stitch together or anchor the blood vessels as they penetrate into the interior of the bone. Okay, please don't be bothered by my use of the word anchoring. What I'm suggesting is analogous to the following. If you think about the room that you're sitting in, most people are in a room where there's a window or something. And so what I'm saying is that the wall of your room provided a surface, a structure to embed, to anchor the window. If you're in an internal room, you might not have a window, but I bet you have a door, right? So the wall provides an anchoring surface to hang a door so that you can enter and exit the room and have some privacy when you want, right? So the periosteum is kind of like that. It provides an anchoring structure to tack down the blood vessels as they go through the interior anatomy of the bone. Okay, another feature here that I can highlight for you in figure 6.3 is that the periosteum is literally stitched. It is stitched, okay, stitched to the surface of the compact bone by things called perforating fibers, okay? And so have a very close look at figure 6.3. Do you see the perforating fibers? Okay, it's on the bottom right corner of picture A there, perforating fibers, okay? So the periosteum is literally stitched to the surface of compact bone by these fibers, these threads, if you will, that are called perforating fibers. Okay, perforating fibers are also known as Chpt fibers. Also known as Chpt fibers. Okay, and let me just give you one piece of information about Chpt fibers. Chpt fibers are basically chains of polymerated of polymerized collagen protein. Okay, so that drawing you see there, you see these very thin, wispy, perforating fibers. They're simply tubes of collagen protein. That's what they are. Okay, perforating fibers are made of bundles of collagen protein linked together. Hopefully that's not a surprise to you, because as you know, collagen is the most abundant protein in the body. It serves a tremendous structural role throughout the fabric of your body's anatomy. Okay. All right, folks. Any questions right now? Okay, let's continue. We're almost done looking at figure 6.1. If you want to page back to figure 6.1, that might be useful for you. The next structure that I'm going to put into your notes is the medullary, or also known as bone marrow cavity. Okay, and so, as you look at the anatomy of the long bone in figure 6.1, notice that the medullary cavity, as shown and diagrammed in figure 6.1, is in the diaphysis, and it's in that space of a long bone that you're going to find predominantly yellow bone marrow. Okay, so yellow bone marrow is going to be found predominantly in the diaphysis of your long bones. Okay, let's see here. Let's see, I just want to be sure I had something in your notes. Okay, I did miss it. Okay. Up here in our notes, when we started today, I said that bones store materials, letter A is minerals, and I went on to some description of calcium and phosphorus. The other thing I forgot to put here, I'm going to correct that right now, is that your bones actually store triglyceride, so biochemical fuel, right? And it bears repeating that this biochemical fuel is predominantly stored in the yellow bone marrow. All right, so I'm going to put that again down in our current location. Yellow marrow is found predominantly in the diaphysis of the long bones. And it is in this location you will find triglyceride stored. Okay, so I do appreciate that most of us today are blessed to live in the United States, where we tend to have access to abundant quantities of food, and that's a blessing. Okay, however, our ancestors did not always live in an environment where there was quick and easy access to food. And so understand that our bodies evolved in such a way to hold on to energy-rich molecules so that you could survive weeks on end without having a really good steady meal, and you could live, right? Okay. So the yellow marrow is found in the diaphysis of the long bones, and this is where you're going to find your yellow. This is when you're going to find your triglyceride. Okay. You will find some red bone marrow in a long bone, typically in the epiphyseal and metaphyseal regions. Red bone marrow is found in the epiphyseal and metaphyseal regions of a long bone. Okay. So remember, right now our conversation is about long bones, like the femur, like the radius, ulna, humerus, those types of things, okay? If we were to talk about short stubby bones, like the bones of your vertebral column, short stubby bones tend not to have very much, if any, yellow bone marrow. They tend to have red marrow, okay? So you will find red marrow in the bones of your skull. You'll find red marrow in the bones of your vertebral column. You'll find some red marrow in your ribs, but not so much yellow marrow. Okay, yellow marrow is going to be in the diaphysis of the long bones because that's the anatomy of your body that has the greatest internal volume, that has the option of storing some triglyceride. Okay. Okay. All right. So that's the medullary cavity. You see it right there, figure 6.1. Okay. Okay, last thing I'm going to mention to you from this picture is the endosteum. Okay, take a look along the right-hand side of the terms, picture A, figure 6.1, notice endosteum. The endosteum is a thin membrane that lines the medullary cavity. What is significant about the endosteum is that the endosteum is made of a single layer of what is called bone-forming cells. Basically, bone-forming stem cells make up a thin layer of cells that we call the endosteum that lines the inside of the marrow cavity, okay? This contains a single layer of bone-forming stem cells. And so, you know, anytime your bones need to grow and or your bones need to heal from some kind of injury, if new bone cells are needed, as long as the endosteum has not been damaged, then the bone has the capacity to perform mitosis, make new cells, replace the damaged, worn out cells, and maintain the health of the bone as an organ, okay? All right. Okay, gang. As you look across figure 6.1, are there any questions you would like to ask? Okay, all right. So we're going to switch gears now from the long bone anatomy, and we're going to start talking about the histology of bone tissue. We're going to talk about the different types of cells that we would be capable of finding if we looked microscopically into the bone tissue itself. What would we find? So I'm going to be drawing your attention to figure 6.2, which in my book is page 181, figure 6.2. Bone tissue histology. Okay, so the first thing we'll mention is this. Remember that bones, you know, when we think about our four major tissue categories, right? Epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. We understand that bone tissue is appropriately described as a connective tissue. And you recall from chapter 4, connective tissues are a little bit unusual in the fact that they not only have cells, but they also have extracellular matrix. So let's talk about the extracellular matrix of bone. The extracellular matrix of bone tissue is made of the following, and I'm just taking numbers out of your book, so there's no mystery here. 15% water, 30% collagen fibers, and 55% crystallized mineral salts. Okay. If you were to look, if you were to get a really good image of the extracellular matrix of bone, you would find things that look like they're made of crystals. Okay, so let me ask this in the chat window. Have you ever seen or eaten a piece of rock salt candy? You know what I mean by rock salt candy? Okay, so I'm getting some no here. So let's see if we can find an image of rock salt candy. Let's see. Here we go. Maybe this is a better image. Here we go. All right, so here's rock salt candy. And just take a look at the surface of the rock salt candy. You see it looks kind of rough, kind of granular, at moments kind of sharp and jaggedy with all these tiny little crystals, okay? Well, that is kind of like how the internal composition of the extracellular matrix of your bone looks, okay? Because the minerals that make up the extracellular matrix, they will form these tiny little crystal-like objects in the bone tissue itself, okay? So that's the imagery I would want you to have in your mind when you think about the extracellular matrix of bone, okay? All right. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the characteristics of the extracellular matrix, okay? Now, when we say crystallized mineral salts, you know, the mineral salts that we're talking about are calcium and phosphorus. And the calcium and phosphorus minerals will crystallize into objects that kind of look similar to rock salt candy, okay? So a bone's hardness, okay, the hardness of the bone depends on the crystallized mineral salts, right? The crystallized calcium and phosphorus. Okay, so the first feature of bone extracellular matrix is the hardness, right? If you think about your bones, they are hard, right? They're pretty tough, durable objects that they're not. It's not like you can't injure bone. Of course you can injure bone, but bone tends to be pretty hard stuff, particularly for folks that are young, okay? So bone's hardness depends on the composition of the crystallized mineral salts and the bone's flexibility, okay? Bones will flex a little bit, right? They'll kind of be like a tree that's outside and it kind of bends a little bit and bows a little bit when the winds of a hurricane are coming across the branches. It will bend a little bit, okay? So a bone's flexibility depends on the collagen fibers that we listed out, the 30% collagen fibers. All right. So we have hardness and flexibility as two physical characteristics of bones that are endowed by the chemical properties of the extracellular matrix. And for here, I would use an analogy to get you to think about this, okay? Let me ask you a question in the chat window. Here we go. Have you ever been driving along the highway and noticed some construction where you could see steel reinforced concrete? Okay, do you know what I mean by steel reinforced concrete, right? Big hunks of cement with some steel tubes sticking through them, okay? That's the imagery that I would like you to have in your mind when you think about the hardness and flexibility characteristics of the bone that's endowed by the chemical composition of the extracellular matrix of bone. So, you know, why bridge and highway engineers, why do they build bridges and highways out of steel reinforced concrete? Well, for two reasons. The concrete provides a very firm hardness that we can use to support, weight. But at the same time, when cars are going over a bridge, we don't want the bridge to be overly brittle. We want it to be able to bend and flex just a little bit, right? And so that's why steel rebar is stuck through there. So the combination of cement and steel provides the perfect kind of material to build bridges, highways, and things such as this. And it's the same thing with our bones. So when you think about the extracellular matrix of bones, think about steel reinforced concrete. Okay. The concrete is going to be analogous to the crystallized mineral salts. That provides the hardness to our bones. And the steel, the steel rebar, the steel tubes, the beams of steel that you see stuck through the concrete, this is analogous to the collagen fiber, which provides the flexibility. Okay. All right, folks, so that's just a little bit about the extracellular matrix of bone. Would you have any questions you'd like to ask? Okay, next, we have to talk about the cells that we find in the bone tissue. And this is where figure 6.2 will really come into play. All right. So let me start with a caution point here, okay? Our bones are organs. As an organ is made of multiple tissues. As a tissue, there's multiple types of cells present. So our bones are living dynamic structures that are constantly in flux and change. The specific types of bone cells you find in your skeleton today is different than what it was when you were 8 years old. And if we're being really frank, the specific types and numbers of bone cells in your bones of your skeleton today are different today than they were last month. My point is that our bodies are alive. Cells are living things, and they're constantly changing and fluctuating based on environmental pressures. And part of those environmental pressures could be things like if last year you didn't do any exercise because you were depressed from COVID, and this year things are starting to get better, so you're back out exercising and things, that would change the density of your bone, which would change the composition of the extracellular matrix and the population of cells you find in your bones. Okay, so please appreciate that the composition of bones is in constant dynamic flux. Okay, both the extracellular matrix and the population of cells present in your bone is going to change all the time. Okay. All right, so we're going to list out some of the bone cells that science has something to say about, okay? And as I said, we're not going to have all these bone cells in great quantities at every stage of our life. We'll have various amounts at different times, okay? So let's talk about the first type of cell on figure 6.2. It's called the osteoprogenitor cell, okay? Osteoprogenitor cells are also known as osteogenic cells. I know it would be very nice if humanity could get its act together and just have one precise term for everything rather than needing to have 12 synonymous terms, but life is messy. It never works that way. It never works that way, okay? That's because, you know, when scientists and people are studying things, you might have somebody in the United States studying something, they find it, they discover it, they name it. Then somebody in Australia discovers the same thing and gives it a different name. Somebody in Russia finds the same thing, gives it a different name. All of a sudden we have 3 terms being used to reference the same physical object. That's part of the messiness of our language and our human experience. So the osteoprogenitor cells are also called osteogenic cells. These are the unspecialized bone cells, okay? The unspecialized bone cells, which form from a primitive type of embryonic connective tissue, which you might recall studying in chapter 4, called the mesenchyme. These are unspecialized bone stem cells, which are derived from the mesenchyme. If you don't know what mesenchyme is, have a quick bit, you know, during your study time, take a quick look back into chapter 4 for that, okay? But the osteoprogenitor cells differentiate from the mesenchyme before you are ever born, okay? The osteoprogenitor cells are the only cells of the bone that are capable of forming new cells. They're the only cells that can perform mitosis, okay? And so you can expect that you're going to find osteoprogenitor cells as part of the endosteum structure that I highlighted in figure 6.1, right? They're part of the endosteum membrane lining the medullary cavity. These cells are found in the endosteum and are capable of mitosis. Okay, so you know, you're going to find a large number of osteoprogenitor cells when you were an embryo inside your mother's womb, as the very structure of your body was unfolding and being developed during 9 months of pregnancy. Okay. All right. So those are the osteoprogenitor cells. Next, we have the osteoblasts. Okay. You notice if you look carefully at figure 6.2, I'm going to ask you a question in the chat window here. Here we go. In figure 6.2, what 4 words are above the drawing of an osteoblast? What 4 words are above the drawing of an osteoblast? Okay, what's your book telling you there, folks? Okay, all right. Thank you, Karen and Noah. Appreciate that. And hopefully others are keying in on it at this time, right? It says from bone cell lineage. And that's the point I want to make. The cells that you see in figure 6.2 from osteoprogenitor to osteoblast to osteocyte are related to each other from an ancestry perspective. It's like you're related to your dad and your dad's related to his dad. So that would be your grandfather, right? And if you have children, your boy is your son, okay? So these cells are related to each other in a biologically developmental pathway, a sequence of events. When one kind of cell leads to another kind of cell, that kind of heritable relationship, okay? So osteoblasts are known as bone building cells. Okay. Osteoblasts are responsible for a process known as bone deposition. They're responsible for a process called bone deposition. And bone deposition is the process in which new extracellular matrix is manufactured and secreted from the cell into the surrounding space. So when we say that these are bone building cells, basically what they're doing to build the bone is manufacturing what will become the extracellular matrix. That is deposition. Okay. These are the cells. Let me put that as a separate bullet point here. These are the cells primarily responsible for manufacturing large quantities of extracellular matrix. Okay. Question in the chat window. True or false? Osteoblasts cannot make collagen protein. What do you think, folks? True or false? Osteoblasts cannot make collagen protein. Okay. So it seems like several of you are suggesting that the answer is false, and you are correct. Good job, folks, right? What, it doesn't seem reasonable. I mean, it doesn't seem reasonable to tell you that the osteoblasts can make extracellular matrix and then say that they can't make collagen. That seems illogical, okay? I mean, if that were true, then there must be something peculiar going on there. Osteoblasts can manufacture large quantities of collagen protein secreted out into the extracellular space for it to polymerize into the collagen fibers, okay? All right. Okay, so osteoblasts, last thing I'll mention here is osteoblasts differentiate from the osteoprogenitor cells. Okay, these cells are formed by differentiation of osteoprogenitor cells. Okay, next. Third type of cell is your osteocyte. Okay, your osteocyte, this is, as you can see in your book here, it says it maintains bone tissue. And so I think of these cells as sort of the mature bone cells. The bones have been formed, they've been created through the activities of the osteoprogenitor cells and the osteoblasts. But then we need a type of cell whose primary function is to maintain what has been built, In many ways, the osteocytes are kind of like mom and dad, right? They maintain the household. They work the job, pay the bills, put food on the table, make sure there's heat on in the wintertime, right? These are the mom and dad cells that maintain what has been created. These are bone maintenance cells, okay? They are responsible for the everyday upkeep of the bone tissue. Okay, the osteocytes themselves, well, how do they form? They also form from differentiated osteoblasts. Okay. All right, folks. So, All right, let's see here. There's a couple things we can talk about. Okay, let me get one more type of cell in your notes. Okay, so the osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts and osteocytes, they have a ancestry and are related to each other. Do you see in figure 6.2 of your book that between osteocyte and osteoclast, there is a light blue bar, a light blue vertical rectangle between the osteocyte and the next kind of cell, an osteoclast. And the reason that bar is there is because if you read the 5 words above an osteoclast, notice it says from a white blood cell lineage. Okay, so the first 3 cells in figure 6.2, osteoprogenitor cell, osteoblast, osteocyte, they are from a bone cell lineage, and those 3 cells are related to each other genetically. An osteoclast forms from white blood cells, so it's a different ancestry, it's a different lineage. So osteocytes and osteoclasts are kind of like 2 people that evolved on different locations of the planet. Okay, they're not as related to each other as the first 3 cells of figure 6.2 are. But we need to talk about that. Okay, osteoclasts. Okay, these cells are, let's see here. These cells are bone resorption cells. Okay, and when I say bone resorption, I'm talking about literally the breakdown of the extracellular matrix. Okay, these cells are capable of breaking down the extracellular matrix. Okay. So let's see, I should put into your notes that these osteoclasts do not share a lineage with the first 3 cells of our list. These cells are related to white blood cells of the bloodstream. They are not related to the bone cells themselves. Okay, so osteoclasts are found in the bone, but they're not related to your typical bone cell. They're related to the blood cells. Okay, let's see what else we should say here. If you look very carefully, osteoclasts are multinucleated. Do you see that? They're multinucleated. Okay, so I have a question in the chat window. What other type of cell did you learn about in chapter 4 that is multinucleated? Do you remember, folks? Chapter 4 presented a cell that was multinucleated. Okay, we're almost out of time here, so I'm going to run with the first answer. Noah, you are correct. You remember when you studied skeletal muscle fibers. Skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. And we said that that's kind of unusual. It is unusual, but there are some other beasts inside your body that are also multinucleated. And here we come across another one. Osteoclasts are multinucleated cells of the bone. Okay. Osteoclasts themselves form by having small precursor cells with individual nuclei fused together. those individual cells are known as monocytes. Okay, osteoclasts form from the fusion of smaller single nuclei cells called monocytes. You say, man, why has this got to be so convoluted? Why has it got to be so complicated? I share your pain with that. It is, but it is what we have to deal with here. Okay. All right. So, what I'll be starting with next time. Next time, I plan on showing you a video about something here, but I don't have quite time to show it to you today. But let me throw an idea out into your brain here that, our bones are constantly being remodeled, which is to say their density is being adjusted. Like I said, if you weren't exercising last year, but now you're lifting weights at the gym, you can expect more dense bones. If you were exercising last year and you're not exercising, then you're going to have less density to the bones. And the point of it is that our bones are constantly being remodeled depending on the kind of environmental forces we're putting on our skeleton through exercise and nutrition. Are we eating a nutritious diet or are we not? Are we getting plenty of calcium or are we not? Okay, so these things are happening all the time. And so there's a constant tug of war to remodel the bone based on this tug of war between osteoblasts involved in bone deposition and osteoclasts involved in bone resorption. So I'm putting in your notes here. There's a constant tug of war to maintain the correct physical characteristics of bone by balancing the activities of osteoblasts, which are responsible for bone deposition, with osteoclasts, which are involved in bone resorption. We'll talk more about this next time, and I will show you a video next time that helps give you a way to think about this. Okay, folks, I'm definitely over time. I'm going to stop right here and apologize. I'm a couple minutes over. Folks, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? Okay, if not, then I'll wish you a good day and I'll see you on Wednesday, okay? Take care of yourself.
Thanks, you too. Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye for now.